Before I conclude this presentation, I want to look at one more real-life example of group collaborative activities and collaborative information retrieval gone horribly wrong. So we're going to look at the famous Challenger explosion. This event actually happened before the explosion of Columbia. Challenger occurred in 1986. Columbia exploded in 2003. But I chose to talk about the latter event first because it was a case where the main problem was simply a breakdown in communication, where a loss of that necessary flow of information we've been talking so much about happened. The Challenger, on the other hand, is a bit different because although there certainly were problems with communication and the flow of information, there's even a more alarming and dangerous problem on display with Challenger, and that was this phenomenon known as groupthink, which I'll get into in more detail in a moment. But first, I want to explain that the Challenger explosion was really culturally significant for a number of reasons. One of them being that of the 7 people on board who lost their lives, one of them was a woman by the name of Christy McCullough. She was a teacher from my home state of New Hampshire. I live in the Great White Mountains of the area, and she was from around here as well. She'd been chosen as the first person to teach in space. She won a contest for it, and she was going to conduct classes on the shuttle and then have those classes transmit back home. So this disaster was made all the more tragic by the fact that they had a civilian on board. Now, to go back to how the Challenger explosion was a prime example of a flawed communication system, there were so many instances when the catastrophe could have been avoided in the first place. For instance, there were some concerns about the faulty O-ring, the cold temperature on the morning of takeoff, and even the possibility of seal leakage on previous flights. But all of these concerns were confined to one level of the organization. And by that, I mean, if you go to the annotated bibliography that we provide, there's an article on the Challenger explosion. I recommend you read it. It's, again, kind of like the Columbia article. Very fascinating and very sad. Basically, the author of that paper writes that the 3 concerns I just mentioned, the faulty O-ring, the seal leakage on previous flights, and the cold temperature on the morning of takeoff, all these concerns were, quote, confined to people with level 4 clearance, meaning the contractor, and level 3 clearance, meaning some of the engineers at the Marshall and Kennedy Space Centers. But overall, these concerns were, quote, never relayed to levels 1 and 2, the higher-ups, meaning that the cause of the tragedy, which was ultimately determined by the Presidential Commission to be a defective O-ring seal on the rocket, a problem, quote, exacerbated by the cold weather, unquote, could have easily been prevented if the information had been correctly and effectively transmitted. However, a week full of information was not really the biggest problem and contributor to the Challenger's destruction like it was with Columbia. And for Columbia, as I just said the last slide, the issue was there was not enough information being given to the higher-ups. Challenger is a bit different because the fault lies more with the information culture overall of NASA, because NASA developed a really bad groupthink mindset. The technical definition of groupthink, which you can find in the article mentioned in our annotated bibliography, it's written by James Esser and Joanne Linderford. They define groupthink as, quote, a psychological phenomenon that occurs within a group of people in which the desire for harmony or conformity in the group results in an irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcome, unquote. As you can see from the slide here, I decided to summarize groupthink as when group collaboration becomes group dereliction. I just made this thing up, but I thought it made a lot of sense because from what I know about groupthink, it's not as if information is not being shared and communicated in instances of groupthink. On the contrary, it's more the problem is that certain information is being stifled, which is obviously just as dangerous and concerning as not having enough information, especially when it comes to something as serious and life-threatening as a space shuttle launch. For the Challenger, this came into play when the launch was delayed a few times. It was actually supposed to go off 3 different instances before the fatal launch, and then of course after this happened, the press and the general public started to get a bit antsy. They were calling NASA out and saying it was taking too long and they were stalling. So the higher ups in the organization, they were more concerned with their reputations and looking good to the public and sticking to the planned schedule rather than ensuring the safety of the shuttle's passengers. So those higher ups decided to discount information given to them about the dangers of launching that particular morning due to the weather. And the groupthink mindset of the entire organization meant that no one really dared to step up and call out the safety and ethical implications of what was about to go down. You remember I just mentioned a slide earlier that the first sentence in my article, the Hansen article, states that it is, quote, essential for professional workers to stay both informed and inform their work environments in order to effectively manage knowledge and stay competitive, efficient, and innovative. I really want to place emphasis on this last part of the statement, especially the part about staying innovative, because this is precisely what groupthink erodes the most, because in that kind of environment, individual members of a group are strongly discouraged from expressing any type of disagreement with the general consensus, and they feel compelled to set aside their own thoughts and feelings and kind of just blindly follow the word of other group members, especially those in charge. And so risk taking becomes really common, and there's a bad lack of creative thinking going on. So obviously, innovation erodes. So, in other words, organizations want that knowledge culture we've been talking about, that dynamic knowledge one. But a groupthink culture is exactly the opposite of a knowledge culture. And NASA made the 7 people on board the Challenger pay the ultimate price for having this groupthink infested environment. I think this real life example is a true testament to just how essential it is for an organization, any organization, let alone one as important as NASA, to carefully and methodically put healthy and sound communication structures in place, so that information sharing, learning, seeking, and retrieving anything like that is easily and frequently done among all members of the organization on a regular basis. It's so crucial, especially in cases of life and death like it was here. Okay, so if you're interested in learning more about the Challenger explosion and how groupthink played a role in it, I encourage you to watch the video right below this one. It's a fairly short clip, only like I think 3 minutes long, maybe a little over that. But it does a really nice job of summarizing all the key points of the issue. And of course, I'd also encourage you to glance over the article that I mentioned in the annotated bibliography about the Challenger. It's definitely a fascinating read. And thank you again for watching our presentation.